some ahistorical legal theory that won't be, I'm afraid, taking into account the whole history of law. It's going to be, I want to pick up on, rather than try to do the talk I was going to do, I thought I'd just try to pick up on a couple of the themes that came out of the questions in the previous session. In particular, the question of ontology, and why ontology is important for thinking about criminal law. The title of my talk is The Criminal Justice and Human Freedom. So what does criminal justice have to do with human freedom? Now, I might think it's about, it's very little to do with human freedom. It's about coercion. It's about curtailing freedom, if anything. The norms of criminal law, the general part of criminal law as it's called, the basic norms of liability, don't say anything much about freedom. We find one or two mentions of freedom in criminal law doctrine, in consent, and I'm talking really, you know, I've got no authority to talk about Indian criminal law. In criminal law of England and Wales, we find one or two mentions of freedom in consent law, in defences about voluntariness, so duress. We find occasional glimpses that perhaps it's not quite right that criminal law doesn't care about freedom, that it's only interested in agency, but it's not interested in free agency. There are these glimpses that in actual fact criminal law presupposes not just that we're agents acting, but that we're agents acting freely, that we're free agents or autonomous agents. And we find this, of course, in the liberal theories of criminal law. We find it in Andrew Ashworth. And there's a passage from Andrew Ashworth that I think is quite a nice passage. It sort of sums up the ambivalence in liberal criminal law theory towards the problem of freedom. He says, one of the fundamental concepts to the justification of criminal laws is the principle of individual autonomy, that each individual should be treated as responsible for his or her own behaviour. And the factual element in autonomy, as he puts it, the factual element, is that individuals in general do have the capacity and sufficient free will to make meaningful choices. Whether this is true cannot be demonstrated. So it's a factual element that cannot be demonstrated. Okay, and that's kind of the problem for criminal law, that it ultimately is in a position where it has to assume that agency is autonomous, because otherwise it doesn't make sense to hold people responsible for what they do. Merely the fact that you're an agent and that you did something is not really here or there. We see that because we find that you might do something under duress, and in that case you've not acted freely and so you're not held responsible. So it's not enough to just be an agent acting. Really, you have to be acting autonomously, and that means you have to have sufficient free will to make meaningful choices. And yet we don't actually know whether people do. And the leading liberal theorists admit that this is something we don't actually have any ability to demonstrate. We just have to assume it. And that's, you know, that's right at the start. That passage is from right at the start of Principles of Criminal Law, the sort of canonical contemporary liberal accounts of criminal law. And you know, we get that in the first few pages. It's on page 23. And then we have another 500 pages in which the question or the problem of whether or not people are autonomous is never revisited. It's just left to hang there, and then we say, well, let's just move on and not worry about that. Let's get into the details of criminal law. Okay, so that's kind of the sort of setup, I suppose. And then I want to say something about why ontology is important in thinking about this problem. There's a basic philosophical assumption. It's not just in criminal law, it's in contemporary, it's in modern philosophy, it's exemplified in Kant, we find it in contemporary moral philosophy, the view that agency is necessarily autonomous. That insofar as you're acting as an agent, actually, it's not possible to be acting as an agent but not to be doing so autonomously. And this is because we have the power, a special kind of rational power, which means that regardless of whatever constraints there might seem to be on the way that we act, we've always got the possibility, we always have the power to do otherwise than we do. We always have the power to use reason, and contemporary Kantians talk about the power to step back from your motives, desires, fears, whatever factors might seem to have caused or led to a criminal action. The agent always, in fact, has the rational power to stand back from the motives and the drives and the forces that lead to action and exercise rationality, exercise reason, to evaluate those desires, those motives, those fears, and rule them in or out, decide whether or not to make them the principles of your action. That's the sort of philosophical underpinning. And where does that leave us when we look at criminal law? A good example of the problem that that sort of view creates for criminal law is the prevalence of psychopathologies of various kinds amongst the offender population. Around 3/4 of the prison population in England and Wales have psychopathology, one or more serious psychopathologies, such as personality disorders, addictions, and other disorders. Now, this creates a lot of difficulty when we're trying to assess the justice of blaming people and holding them responsible for what they do, when what they do seems to be shaped by a disorder of some kind, or a pathology of their agency. These sorts of psychopathologies are sometimes referred to as disorders of agency or pathologies of agency. Why does psychopathology create a problem for our desire to blame in a way that's justified? Well, one reason might be that psychopathology is at least a good case, at least one important case of a lack of autonomy in agency. We think about somebody like an addict or a phobic. If somebody who's got a drug addiction or someone who's got a paralysing phobia of something is still acting as an agent when they're taking their drug that they're addicted to, or when they're fleeing the scene of the terror that might be a spider in my case, or whatever else it is that rocks your boat. People are still acting, the agent is still acting as an agent, but they don't seem to be acting autonomously. It doesn't seem to be the case that their reason is shaping their conduct. Because for one thing, if you ask a phobic, why are you running away from that little spider, they're not going to give you a host of good reasons. They're going to say, well, to be honest, I don't know. It's crazy, isn't it? I can't make sense of it myself. It's a crisis of intelligibility that an agent in that sort of situation faces. They're not able to make sense of their own motives and their own actions. And Alan raised the question of what a criminal might say if we asked them why they committed an offence. They're not going to say, to reproduce criminogenic structures. No, they're not. But in some cases, of course, they will give various instrumental reasons, things that they were pursuing in acting. But in a lot of cases, and here I would to some extent speak anecdotally, I did spend a little bit of time working in the probation service and working with offenders. And actually, when you ask them why they did what they did, a lot of the time they say something like, I don't really know. I can't really make sense of it. Yeah, when I look at it now, it didn't, why did I do it? There's a crisis of unintelligibility, and that's something that really is quite in conflict with the idea of autonomous agency, of free action. The idea of autonomous action is that one, in Augustine's phrase, the agent knows the end under the aspect of the end. They know what they're pursuing, and they know it as something worth pursuing. And for non-autonomous agents, for heteronymous agents and free agents, and phobics or addicts might be cases of this, the agent doesn't know the end they're pursuing under the aspect of the end. They don't know really why they're doing what they're doing. It doesn't make sense to them as something valuable to pursue. Okay, so this suggests a gap between agency and autonomy that's denied in both the positivist and the idealist philosophical traditions. And this is where ontology becomes important. The gist, I think, of what I want to say here is that a critical realist conception of human beings is precisely one that's capable of sustaining a difference. To come back to the ontology point, is I think Derrida really doesn't quite understand the point of ontology in an Aristotelian sense of ontology. It's not the Platonic ontology of independently existing forms that are transcendent in some way. It's a realist ontology is about saying that we have a real nature, but that nature is one that we are real. We're substances, if you like. We're bearers of a certain kind of form, the human form. But our nature is a developmental potentiality. The essence of human being is not something that's automatically given. It's something that must develop and come to be in the world. And in order to develop our essential nature and the powers, including the rational powers that are essential, that are part of our essential nature, we need certain kinds of conditions in the world. To become autonomous requires developmental conditions, the right sort of conditions to develop the powers of autonomy. And when we look at something like psychopathology, what we find there is agency, but agency in which the rational powers constitutive of autonomous agency have not been able to develop properly. And then when we look at what sort of real conditions might lead to psychopathology, well, the comorbid factors are social hardships and deprivation, childhood trauma, are developmental privations that are structured by various axes of social injustice and oppression. Now, the important point about psychoanalysis in all this, and why psychoanalysis and critical realism go together, is that psychoanalysis helps us to understand at the individual level the developmental and the precarious developmental process and the social, the relational conditions that that developmental process requires if we're to develop the powers to become autonomous. And if we don't get the right sort of relational conditions when we're very young, and the history of psychoanalysis has gone from saying, well, it's about when you're 3, 4, 5, to saying actually it's about the first sort of 6 months and 12 months. If we don't get the right relational conditions, then we don't. Then it becomes difficult to develop the rational powers of autonomy. And psychoanalysis actually gives us some important concepts for understanding what those rational powers amount to. And they amount to things like containment in Wilfred Bion's work, the capacity to localize emotional reactions to your own mind, to be able to contain unconscious fantasies instead of projecting them onto the world or acting them out in the world and reflectively. So the sorts of privations of our powers that psychoanalysis has traced to developmental privations and social injustices help us to flesh out this thought, this realist thought, that we are bearers of the human form and we are agents as bearers of the human form, but we're not necessarily free. That autonomy, far from being something that is given as a metaphysical feature of rational agency, which is how the Kantian tradition sees it, it is something that is a difficult accomplishment that requires psychological, relational, and ultimately social conditions to make it a possibility. And so I'll just conclude with a thought about what this tells us for, or how we might think about criminal justice in light of some of these ideas about the category of unfree agency. What sort of practice might we have if our practice of holding responsible is based on a fictional assumption that agents are per se autonomous? What does that mean? What would we have to do then? Do we just get rid of the practice of holding responsible and have a reifying, objectifying, ethically unserious life together instead? That's what retributivists claim. The new retributivists of the 1970s said, if you don't hold responsible, you'll just be, the only other option is to reify people and treat them as bits of mere nature. And then we have an ethically, that's where it leads. If you criticise criminal law in terms of the problem of freedom, then you're really saying that we should just let everybody off the hook, that everybody has an excuse, everybody has an exemption, and you've got nothing ethically serious to say. Well, I would propose a different way of thinking about it. Bernard Williams really brings out nicely this error of thinking that our particular practice of holding responsible that we've developed and sort of refined in the modern period is all there is to our possibilities for ethical practice. But that's a very narrow-minded way of looking at it. And I would suggest, well, I'll just put this out there and I won't have time to develop what I mean really, but we might think that what we need is an ethical practice about responsibility that's appropriate to the reality of not free agency, but unfree agency. Now, unfree agents are still agents, and if we do something heteronomously, we still do it, and there's still a process, both first personally, of coming to terms with what we've done, albeit that we weren't free in doing so, and a dialogical process, a second personal process of relating to a person who's done something seriously wrong. Even if they did do it unfreely, how we relate to them and how we move forward with them in a dialogue. And what would be the aim of that dialogue? Well, I would say it would be the aim would be a process that instead of assuming people are autonomous when they do something wrong, and if you may have noticed, the more wrong what you did was, the more autonomous you must have been, is the sort of assumption. You know, when the killers of Jamie Bolger, Thompson and Venables, where they were 10 years old at the time, well, if they'd have stolen a Mars bar, we'd have said they're only children, but because they killed somebody, we said, well, no, they must really have been autonomous agents. They need to be blamed and punished. But why don't we say, instead of assuming that people are autonomous, we'll say, look, we know that you're not necessarily autonomous, but we want to have a process that leads towards autonomy in a relational, in a dialogical way. A process of coming to terms with what's been unfreely done and moving in a direction of coming to terms with that in a more autonomous fashion. And I call that a process and a practice of calling on each other to take responsibility, and on calling on oneself to take responsibility in a dynamic process rather than a static mode of attributing responsibility and assuming freedom. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much. Okay, now we're going to proceed to the next session. We will have a chance to come back to comments on this. But also you're talking this afternoon. So
I'm talking again later, yeah, so I'm hogging it anyway. Yeah.
So now delighted to have Professor Pandey, who's I'm particularly delighted since he's been so instrumental in our being here, to welcome him to come.